Okay, in this session we're going to be looking at how organisations can create and capture value, moving beyond the notion of product or service development. So we're going into the area of innovation capabilities, so above and beyond individual products, and what capabilities can organisations create and develop and sustain to create innovations broadly defined. Okay, that's a familiar slide, isn't it? Let's hope the slides that follow are the right ones. Okay, so we begin by looking at some of the evidence, what works, what doesn't, and why. Okay, but more importantly, we need to develop a shared language or vocabulary about what we mean by capabilities, because they're very slippery characters. Okay, the things that people nod their heads that make sense. Well, we hope, we shall see. Yeah, but when you go back and try to measure them or manage them, they sort of slip away, much like culture. Okay, so we spend a little bit of time saying, what are they? What do they contribute? How might we assess them? And then the main part of this session will be then to apply that framework to the case study. And the case study is really, again, a sort of shared platform that we can then say, well, how do we put this abstract framework into practice to try to actually identify and assess what these capabilities are, these innovation capabilities. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, if you look at successful organisations over prolonged periods, and so we're not talking about the next big product. We're talking here about developing sustainable capabilities over sustained periods of time. So much like, for example, we've discussed the role of process innovation, yeah? That it tends to be applied to a whole range of products and services over time and create a platform for performance and is difficult to imitate. So that would be a good example of what we're talking about in terms of capability. And you find in terms of long-term innovation performance, companies like 3M, companies like Philips, I guess, which have a long track record, which suggests that they are consistently over time doing something right, rather than just being lucky. And it's interesting how many companies are lucky, because they had the next big thing, and then they interview the CEO or the innovation manager, and it's on the front of Bloomberg magazine or on TV. And you can see, always look in their eyes, and they say, well, how are you so visionary, or how did you anticipate this? And they don't know. They're sort of whirling around thinking, I'm going to take the credit, but I've got no idea. And they'll say something, and often they say something different in the next interview. Yeah, because in innovation, yeah, it's roughly, depending on the nature of the sector, 50% management and 50% luck. Yeah, and the smart thing is to differentiate between the two. Yeah, so there's about half of it that we can influence and manage, so we can get it right more often than not. But by definition, there's an inherent uncertainty. Yeah, what they call it is it Rumsfeld said there's known unknowns and unknown unknowns, or unknowable unknowns, things we don't know that we don't know, which again sounds philosophical, but it is different. Yeah, the things we're not even watching. Yeah, so there is an inherent degree of uncertainty, but the argument is within the things that can be influenced and managed, what we're going to call capabilities, innovation capabilities. Yeah, the trick is to identify what they are, and then to develop and leverage those capabilities. So we're saying they're much more than simply product innovation. Yeah.
I've got a badly structured question, but there's something that seems to be missing from there from my...
I'm sure there's a lot missing from there, yeah.
From just my observation of innovations, especially in the B2B sector, ones that have worked, there's definitely a role for the contact network of the people who are innovating.
Yeah.
Does that just come under unexplained and luck, that they just happen to know the right people? Or?
No, I mean, if you... again, I don't want to digress too much. If you do, there's a whole discipline called network analysis. It's not about telecoms infrastructure, but looking at where innovations come from. That's basically the question. A naive question. Where do innovations come from? And one of the tools you use is network analysis. Yeah? So you track people, and then you track ideas and knowledge. And you can build up these network diagrams by lots of interviews, look at documentation. And they look almost random, but then you find certain nodes. So there are certain people nodes, people who are well connected, but there are also knowledge nodes, interaction of almost pure knowledge. An area from this field makes this possible. And then the smart guys are the ones who realise that. Yeah, so you're dead right. The connections, I'd say, but I think they're in both. It's not really a good answer. You said you had a badly structured question. It's a badly structured answer. I think some of them are in the luck category. Some of the connections are serendipity. You bump into somebody at a conference or an MBA environment and you share some knowledge and you think, actually, that could work in our environment, or I need to contact that guy or that person. So I call that serendipity, but even that has an element, or are you sensitized to that? Yeah? So even that's not entirely serendipity. But there is active search, which we've explored in other modules here, actively trying to look for connections and such like, and that's more explicit and manageable. So I'd argue the whole network argument is partly not random, but partly chance, but a large part about sensitizing yourself and getting out there. Yeah? Because all things being equal, the more you're out there, more likely you're going to bump into something if your eyes are open. Yeah? Okay. So in that sort of context where there is inherent uncertainty, all we can really do is try to manage the things that are more manageable. Okay? Okay. And we're going to focus on bullet number 3, and they're not numbered, so it's not very helpful, is it? We're arguing if you look at sustained success over time, rather than one lucky product, yeah, you find that there are 4 or 5, depends how you cluster this stuff, yeah. Some of it's contextual, yeah. You're in the right place, okay, the right period in time, the right country, the right part of the country, yeah. So there are certain conditions, availability of collaborators, finance, what we call lead users, customers who take risks, yeah? And some of that's luck and some of it's you've deliberately positioned yourself. So some of it's context, the national, the regional system, okay? So far, so good, okay?
So number 3 should be, was the ability to leverage.
Well, before we leverage, you have to identify what they are, but you're dead right. It's not an end in itself. It's to say, okay, we do these things, we do them very well. What else should we do? So it's like a position in innovation or a position innovation. Okay, so we're acknowledging that where you are, your experience and how you've got there, the legacy is both good and bad. It constrains, but also creates opportunities. So we're accepting that. But in terms of things that can be, if you like, actively managed, it's more around bullet point 3. Okay, the capabilities that you can explicitly identify, nurture, develop, and if necessary, renew. Okay, and that's what we're going to focus on in this session. Okay, we are acknowledging the other stuff makes a difference. You know, what you can do in California, you can't even do in Boston, and vice versa. The context has an effect. Yeah, we acknowledge that. Okay, but we're saying the things that are more amenable to management in terms of are these innovation capabilities. Yeah, okay, but they do depend on context. Okay, so if you look at the work in this area, and I'm sure you have, and if you haven't, I'm sure you will at the weekend. Much like product development, it's one of the areas where we have quite a lot of empirical work, some not so good, some better, yeah? So there's a lot of research out there about what are these things, what contribution do they make, how do they create value, but slightly less work on how can we identify them and develop them, which is what is interesting, I think. So, so that's what really bullet number 2 is saying. If you look at all these studies, the vast majority, over 100 of these studies, identify what we're going to call capabilities as being central contributors to the long-term innovation performance. Okay? So we're on pretty sound ground here. We know this stuff is important. It gets trickier, which is also bullet number 2, is to say, well, how do we develop them? We know that these things we're calling capabilities are important for this continuous innovation, but there are only 3 studies that actually looked about where do they come from, how you develop them, which is a trickier question. So there's 2 sort of things. One is to say, what are they? Yeah. And the less tricky thing is we know they make a contribution, much like culture. We know it makes a contribution, but it's really hard to measure and manage. And that's really uncomfortable. So capabilities we know, long-term, continuous, sustainable innovation, they're core, but they're quite tricky to pin down. And that's really why we want to look at the case study and the framework to try to do that. So the focus is in how do we identify them, how do we isolate them, and then how do we grow them.